a coward, low and blinded like a sow. I am a rainstorm, infinity falling down. Came to prop up others, but I'm drooping, can't stay still. I'm weak as some progress, can't escape from myself. Break all the mirrors, don't be afraid of bad luck, 'cause it's the only kind we have here. Break all the mirrors, don't be afraid of bad news, 'cause it's the only kind we have here. It's easy to pass judgment when you're first starting to live all on your own. No, you're not alone, you're just not leaning on the wall. I am a skunk repelling everything I find, searching, not finding any shred of peace of mind. Is it courage to boldly admit to all I lack? Imagine phantom father is never coming back. Break all the mirrors, don't be afraid of bad news, 'cause it's the only kind we have here. Break all the mirrors, don't be afraid of bad luck, 'cause it's the only kind we have here. Are you better than me? 'Cause I'm no better than you. Are you better than me? 'Cause I'm no better, no better. I play my hand conservatively, 'cause a deck ain't in my favor. Yeah, pawn the good ones for later. I don't have a plan, just a sleight of hand. You're a good man, you deserve a good woman.
And welcome to Unquestionable. I am Dan Wu. That's Homebrew, some good friends of mine in the background. Thanks to them for offering that music as my theme music. You're listening to KZSE Santa Cruz, which is the home of Unquestionable, also kzse.org, and we podcast our episodes at various outlets after that. But as a non-commercial educational radio station, KZSE supports free expression of ideas. Please be aware that the opinions expressed are those of the speakers or artists only and do not necessarily reflect the views of the UC Regents, KZSE staff, management, or underwriters. We welcome your feedback on our programming. Please direct your comments to the Program Review Committee at 831-459-4726 or by email at prc@kzsc.org. Ryan Coonerty in the station. Supervisor Ryan Coonerty, how's it going, man?
It's great. Thanks for having me, Dan.
You've actually lived in the area for quite some time, since the 70s, I believe, your whole life, correct?
Yeah, I was born and raised here in Santa Cruz. I left for about 10 years, college and grad school and law school, working back in D.C., and then eventually made my way back to Santa Cruz again.
To keep on that note, what has KZSE meant to you as a longtime Santa Cruz resident?
Sure. No, it's as the media gets consolidated around the world and we get fewer and fewer voices, having a place where people can call in and have a really interactive conversation is invaluable. And so it's been wonderful to be a part of a lot of different KZSE shows over the years. It's always fun. I've been for years calling into Bushwhackers on Friday mornings, and other than having to get up really early, it's always a fun experience to have that never dull dialogue with John Sandage, with Sleepy John, about things going on in this community, and it's just really, it's a great place to have to profile artists and music and ideas, and have just a conversation here in Santa Cruz.
Yeah, I generally only catch Sleepy John if I'm driving back into town, like on an overnight trip. It's just, I commend anyone that comes up here and does a talk show from 6 to 9 in the morning. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, it's, I always try to drink at least a cup and a half of coffee before going on that show, just so I can both be awake and have the energy to keep up with John, because he's just so, such a big personality and smart and funny guy.
The only topic it seems that anyone's talking about in Santa Cruz right now is housing, and it's been that way for many years. When you were a child here, and when I was a child here just shortly after that, by my research, there was about a third to a quarter of the residents that are here now, about, let's say 15 to 20,000 to be safe.
Yeah.
Compared to about 60,000, depending on which sign you look at. They haven't changed the signs in parts of town. How has that been to see a town that you've been so involved in the government basically quadruple in size during your lifetime?
In some ways, it's shocking that, the traffic is definitely way more than I ever remember it growing up. But in other ways, the thing I've always appreciated is that Santa Cruz has really kept its character. We're always at risk of becoming a bedroom community for Silicon Valley, and sort of being swamped by these forces that are a lot bigger than us. And I think the reason I came back to Santa Cruz, and I'm going to raise my kids here, and my wife is also from Santa Cruz, and she came back. The reason we did that is that fundamentally it's still the same community we grew up in. It's still people sort of opting for a very specific way of life, opting to really care about each other and its communities, and having a community that has has a sense of place and a sense of purpose. And so while it's gotten bigger and while housing continues to be the fundamental issue facing us, I also am, I think this is a really wonderful place, and I'm really proud of this community.
Now, you went to the London School of Economics and Politics. That seems like, to me, as a Santa Cruz person, that it seems like a really prestigious and huge name. Did you go to that school because you knew you wanted to work in elected office specifically? And why go to the London School of Economics and Political Science to be a political figure in the small community of Santa Cruz? That honestly, it sounds like such a big name, maybe just because it has the word London in it, that it seems like someone that would be running for higher office than just city and county seats.
Sure. So I think there's a lot of different elements in that. Let me try to explain it, and it's probably not quite as glamorous an explanation as you may think, which is, so I grew up here in Santa Cruz. I went to Santa Cruz High. Then I graduated and went to the University of Oregon, and it was a great school, but I studied American history, and it occurred to me as I was graduating that this world is a big place and a lot bigger than I needed to know more than just American history for a globalized world. And I saw this one-year program where you get a master's degree from London School of Economics. And in part, I wanted to learn more about the rest of the world. In part, I wanted to dodge the real world for a little while longer. And in part, I wanted to have a good reason to be in Europe. So I applied and got in, and it was great. It was, in your classes, there are people from all over the world. So when you're discussing conflicts and wars and other things going on, to have people from those countries and from those cultures discussing those things really brought it alive. I still teach up here at UCSC, and I recommend to all my students that if they can figure out a way to do it, it's a wonderful thing. But then when I graduated, I came back to Santa Cruz. I did a bunch of random jobs in Santa Cruz, like a lot of folks do, to figure out how to live here. Then I eventually went to law school, and I was working in D.C., and I was working in national politics, working for former presidents, working on national security issues. But I really, in part, I missed the Pacific Ocean. In part, I missed just Santa Cruz being Santa Cruz. But in part, I also missed having that connection to how policies impacted real lives. And so, you pass a bill in D.C. and it affects 50 million people, but you're almost likely to meet, it's likely that you'll meet none of them and hear what the actual impact is. Whereas here, working on the city council or as mayor, as county supervisor, I meet people all day, every day, whose lives are being impacted by my policies. and hearing their ideas and what they want and aspire to for our community. And it's just so much more real. And I also get to live by the Pacific Ocean and live in Santa Cruz. It just turned out that this local government gig is a really, it's a great way to be involved. I'm still interested in international issues. I still teach international law up here on occasion, but I'm very happy to be at home at night over in Santa Cruz.
You are actually, your deep roots in Santa Cruz. Your dad moved here as a young adult, but for my entire lifetime, a lot of people have looked at your family and thought kind of like almost it's a sort of the Coonerty mafia sort of thing, because you guys own businesses in town and your dad was on County Board of Supervisors and City Council and you've done the same. And what would you say to critics that say that you're only in your seat because of your family's involvement, or how corrupt is your family and how much of Santa Cruz are you guys actually in charge of?
So I can quickly say and clearly say that we're not corrupt at all. So my parents moved here. My aunt was in the first class at UCSC, and my dad and mom were looking for a bookstore to buy, and they bought a bookstore and a house, and that was the year I was born. And they moved to this town and tried to build an institution that was a gathering place for people in the community. Bookstores play a vital role. Now my younger sister runs the bookstore. And then my dad first ran for office after the earthquake, and 70% of downtown was destroyed, and they needed somebody from the downtown business community to help be on the council and help rebuild downtown and make it, bring it back to life. He did that, and then served one term, and then went back into running the bookstore. And then an opportunity came for him to run for the board, and he ran for the board. Then I got elected to city council, and I got elected to the board. What I tell people every day is, every 4 years, my name's on the ballot. Nobody makes a decision about whether I get to serve other than the voters of Santa Cruz. I walk every neighborhood. I knock doors, and I talk to people about what I want to do and what I don't want to do, and for this community. And every time so far, I've been fortunate enough to have the vast majority of voters say, we want you in office. And so it's an honor to serve, and I do my best and, try to make the decisions that are best for this community.
Speaking of decisions, you guys sort of made a decision about a week ago, a fairly large one. It was the first county supervisor meeting I'd been to in a while. You actually didn't recognize me because my hair's longer, and that was funny. Luckily, Zach was there to vouch for me, Zach Friend, another supervisor. But Don Lane and Fred Keeley and company unveiled a huge measure, and you guys did approve the measure of it's approximately the estimates. It's all estimates at this point, but a proposal that will possibly raise $140 million in different forms over about 30 years to fund various housing-related projects or initiatives in Santa Cruz County. And your approval of that wasn't to approve the measure to go into action. It was to approve that it go before voters in November. Without saying too much right up front about the details of it, what would you like people to know about that measure? And do you actually support it, or did you only support putting it in front of voters?
Sure. That's a great question. So as you mentioned, housing is a major issue facing this community. Until about 10 years ago, local governments had the ability through what's called redevelopment financing to put money into affordable housing projects. The state, when it was having budget problems, eliminated redevelopment and took the money to the state level to pay off their debts. And thus, the local governments for about 10 years haven't had money to pay for affordable housing for the workers, for the workforce and people, who make this community work. That has compounded what was already a really bad situation with our local housing market. And we've been grateful that Fred Keeley and Don Lane, and then about 200 other people who are everything from union members to affordable housing advocates to small business owners to just people, worried about teachers and social workers and police and fire in our community, have come together and they put forward this proposal. You're right that all we could do was vote to put it on the ballot because in California, only the voters can tax themselves. The politicians don't have that ability. So we put it before the voters. I am a supporter of it. I believe that it'll give us tools. Most importantly, the thing I think it does is there's going to be a state bond measure that's going to generate tens and hundreds of millions of dollars that we can bring to this area, but only if we have money to match it. It's one of those things where, like transportation, like these other things, the state says, we'll give you money, but you have to come up with half. If we don't have that money, then we lose out on not only the money that we could have locally, but also on these state and federal dollars. So by passing this, we'll be able to leverage it many times over and bring even more, hundreds of millions of dollars more into this community to build necessary housing so that we can have a place where people who are working, who are playing really important roles in this community, whether they're working in a restaurant or whether they're social workers or whether they're teachers, can afford to live in this community. And so it's not going to solve all the problems, but it's an important first step to helping us address the housing crisis in this community.
One critic of the bill that spoke at public comment said that he did point out the fact that, and I was wondering this too, sitting there looking at all the graphs, and took in as much as I can as a night shift worker at 10 in the morning from the slides you guys had, but it says it estimates that you could fund about 1,041, which actually for an estimate was very exact, homes over a 30-year period that would be quote unquote affordable, or units that would be in that way, whether it's apartments or anything like that. And he said that seems like a very low number for the amount of time. It's about 35 houses a year for a community that's this large. And he said that you guys don't need to have a $140 million measure to get matching funds that you would need, or to get the state's attention and show that you're motivated in this way. He said about $20 million would do the trick to get state funds to come in here freely, showing that you guys are an active partner. What would you say to that being too large of a measure, and also that it's not actually going to do that much?
So, I mean, 1,000 units is 1,000 families living in this community that it would otherwise be priced out. So that has a dramatic impact on lives. And if you think about how those 1,000 units then allow a small business to retain an employee, allow a school to be to have less turnover in teaching, and the impact that can have on kids' lives, that radiates out. So it's 1,000 units may not sound much, but when you take those stories in a community, it really matters. In order to leverage it, I think we need more than $20 million. And also, let's keep in mind, throwing out $20 million, the city's annual budget is $50 million. So for them to find $1 million a year is virtually impossible because it would mean cutting Parks and Rec, or cutting fire, or cutting police, so cutting road maintenance. There's not just $20 million laying around, and it would take, and if the more money we have, the more we can leverage, because there's not only these state funds, there's federal funds, there's private funds that we can leverage. We really need a big injection of money. The affordable housing advocates were originally hoping for a $300 to $350 million tax measure because they thought that was truly what we needed. But after polling and after looking at what this community could bear from a tax point of view, they ended up with this number, which is, again, it's not enough. It doesn't even replace what we lost for redevelopment, but it gives us an ability to access more money to build more units in a way that makes a difference. I also say, one of the most exciting affordable housing programs that I'm strongly supportive of is the building of ADUs, accessory dwelling units, granny units, which is in people's garages or in backyards. The research we've shown is that these units tend to be more affordable because the homeowner is living on site. And so they have an incentive to find a good tenant and not gouge them because they have to live next to them and they want to keep somebody there and they want to keep stability there. So that you have a natural discount that's applied, and then I've initiated a measure at the board, and we're going to be able to grow it if this measure passes, where we'll actually pay homeowners $40,000 a year, $40,000 to build it, if they promise to keep it affordable for 30 years. So in doing so, you have seniors who are in their homes and they may not have cash, but this may be in a way for them to have a caregiver move in. This may be a way for them to have an income stream to supplement their Social Security. And in doing so, you create a win-win. So you allow the senior to stay in their home, or they move into the ADU and they rent out their home. It allows caregivers and other health providers to stay in this community, and it's really a win-win. And so by paying people to build these affordable ADUs, we aren't just going to be relying on big affordable housing projects. We can actually build small-scale units that help not only the families moving into these units, but also the families that are living there. And so I think that's a big opportunity, and if with a little bit of funding, we can generate a lot of affordable housing in this community.
Who's more fashionable, Fred Keeley or Prince?
Probably Fred makes a run at it, but at the end of the day, he was still the county treasurer tax collector. So
I just mean looks. I just mean clothing.
Pure looks.
Not talking about stage presence or anything.
Stage presence. I'll give it to Prince just because Prince set a all new standard. But for Santa Cruz County, Fred Keeley could be our Prince.
Especially
Especially at Warriors game. If you see him at a Warriors game, he really goes all out for being fashion forward.
It's pretty funny as a public official in the Santa Cruz area, and he's also kind of a big deal in California throughout his career. But yeah, he's always so fashionable. I was noticing that at the meeting, the shoes, the pants, I was like the jacket, and it's 10 in the morning, man. Relax a little bit. My partner's from LA, and I was like, isn't he so fashionable? And she's like, why are you so obsessed with that? And I'm like, look at everyone else. They're all in like plaid button-up golf shirts, and he's like at a disco. But a lot of people came out from the business community, and even Brent Adams from the homeless advocacy. He's going to be on next week, actually, on this show.
Oh, right.
Came out in support of this new measure for the ballot. And have you seen anything this widely supported on the housing initiative front in recent memory?
No, and that's sort of what's got us all excited about it, was that these we've seen small business people and union folks and affordable housing advocates and neighborhood advocates just be at odds over everything all the time. And the idea that they've all come together, I think, one, shows just how difficult this problem is and how impactful it is, that everybody's seeing this impact and really sees an emergency need to address it. But then secondly, that they've all pulled together and they've all sort of agreed, and they've agreed on, what the priorities are of this measure. So you'd have money set aside for emergency homeless funding. You'd have ADUs. You'd have first-time homeowner grants, first-time homebuyer grants to help people find that money that they have to put down to get it. You'd have senior housing. You'd have permanent supportive housing for people with mental health challenges, and they can have housing that has both therapy and so I think there's the thing I really like about it is it wasn't a one size fits all. It's recognizing that we need a lot of different approaches to housing for a lot of different populations. And so I'm hopeful it passes. It's going to be a tough road because in California, for the voters to pass a tax increase, it has to be a 2/3 It has to be approved by 2/3 of the voters, not just a majority, and so that's always a high bar to overcome.
You also live in the city, which is an interesting thing with county supervisors. With Bruce McPherson from the kind of mountain district of the county, it was a controversy with his opponents that he lived so close to the city and not way up in the mountains, feeling like Santa Cruz was kind of having an undue influence on the county board. And you live in the city, you've been on the city council, and the same thing happens with Watsonville from time to time. Someone will live in Watsonville City and be on the county board. What do you think about that criticism that Santa Cruz has too much sway over the outer lying county areas by having residents in the city be on the county board?
Sure. So, I mean, I think partly this goes to, and I think probably some of your listeners are probably wondering right now this very question, which is, what is a county supervisor and why do I care? They don't. So just to go, half a county supervisor's job is to represent the unincorporated residents. So these are people who don't live in our county, in the cities of Santa Cruz, Watsonville, Scotts Valley, and Capitola. So about half the residents, if you live in Bonnie Doon, if you live in San Lorenzo Valley, if you live in Live Oak or Soquel or Aptos, you are in an unincorporated area, and we're your sort of first line of government, like a city council would be. That's unusual. In most counties, in Santa Clara County, 95% of the residents live in an incorporated city. And so supervisors don't really see it as their job to provide those sorts of day-to-day services. Santa Cruz County is sort of an interesting anomaly in California, where we have a big percentage of our population that lives in essentially urban areas, but are represented by a board instead of a city. So that's part of our job, and so I represent most the folks on the North Coast, so Davenport and Bonnie Doon, up to the San Mateo County line. But that's only about 8% of my residents, the people I represent, my constituency. The rest of the people live in the city of Santa Cruz, and my job on the board is to provide the county services. So that is everything from running the jail to probation to county mental health to public health to the anti-poverty programs. All of those sorts of programs have a real impact on the people in the city of Santa Cruz, and I consider it to be my job to represent those interests on the board. And so I think it's appropriate for us to be, from this district and to focus both on the issues in the unincorporated area, but also on our county-wide responsibilities, which only we provide.
We'll be back in just a moment. You can join in the conversation here with Santa Cruz County Board Supervisor Ryan Coonerty here on Unquestionable. You're listening to KZSE Santa Cruz. 831-459-4036 is to get your voice in on the conversation. We would love to hear other perspectives on this or other issues that you feel are relevant to the conversation. We'll be back in just a moment here on Unquestionable, KZSE Santa Cruz. Thank you to Do Make Say Think for that 1978 track. That's the name of the track. It's not the year they made it. It's like 1998, I believe. YouTube doesn't know that I have the rights to play that song, and it's been an issue, but almost a victory that YouTube's calling me out, and I have the permission from the band, so YouTube, stop flagging us. We do have County Board Supervisor Ryan Coonerty in the studio with us today. And we got our first call at 831-459-4036 during the break, of course, so I asked that person to call back. This is Unquestionable. I am Dan Wu. This is KZSE Santa Cruz. 831-459-4036 is the number to call in if you would like to be on the air and ask a question of Supervisor Coonerty. We've been talking mostly about the new housing measure that was put on the ballot for the county in November, which would raise an estimated $140 million for housing projects over approximately the next 30 years in Santa Cruz County. And the crux of that bill essentially is a $16 to $17 a year parcel tax, essentially, not a property tax. Don't worry. Prop 13 doesn't allow us to call it a property tax, but it's a parcel tax on units of property in Santa Cruz County, about $17 a year to raise about $140 million. It does vary throughout that period, but $17 seems to be a good middle number for the conversation. And what's your thought on, as a property owner or in a family that owns property at the very least, about this $17 a year tax on each property?
Sure. So it's it's $16 per $100,000 of assessed value. So if your house is $500,000, it's
thank you. I knew there was something missing
so
with that.
it's 16 times 5. So I don't think nobody likes paying taxes, but I also think I also don't like living in a community where working people can't afford to live, and where our community becomes much more of a bedroom community for high tech workers who are making large salaries. I think those folks are fine, but we also need to have teachers and janitors and other folks who are able to live and work in this community. And so I'm willing to pay that tax in order to have my community be more full and more representational.
And a lot of people, well, a couple of people at that meeting actually, and a lot of people just in the general discourse of life, talk about how when they're paying a tax that's maybe kind of specific like this one, just on property owners, that they get upset about, quote unquote, paying for programs that they're not benefiting from, but other people are benefiting from. Isn't it true that everyone subsidizes everyone? Because honestly, like someone making $40,000 to $60,000 a year, which I think I'm kind of in the range of, tips are part of that, so who knows where it ends up. But if they tax all of my pay at $40,000 a year, we probably couldn't pay for the society we have. And the government would then be on the tab for paying for my entire life because they just took all of my money. And we do have a caller coming in. Hold that thought.
Okay.
Let's get to their question here. Hello, you're on KZSE Santa Cruz Unquestionable, I believe. Yes, now you are. Hello.
Hi.
How's it going? Where are you calling from?
Santa Cruz.
Awesome.
Not on topic, but I was wondering if Mr. Coonerty would support a county-wide vote on whether to have a train or a trail on the rail corridor. Put it up to the voters if he'd be willing to support that.
So I think the fundamental question for maybe those who haven't followed this is the Regional Transportation Commission bought the rail corridor that runs from Watsonville to Davenport, and we're going through a process by which we are going to evaluate the best use of that corridor along with the corridors of the highway and Soquel Avenue, with the idea being that it's way too hard for people to move across this county, and people spend a lot of time in traffic that they could otherwise spend in working on these issues, being with their families or being involved in community issues or whatever they may be. There's a big debate going on about whether we want to have a rail and a trail or just a trail, and the question of whether we put to voters. And I think I'm open to it, but I think the problem that we're going to have is neither side is going to agree on what the ballot question is, because one side will say, should we have a world-class trail that extends from Watsonville to Davenport that allows for people to move freely, and you could get one vote, and the other side will say, should we rip up the railroad tracks and give back $20 million of grant money and delay getting a trail built for 10 years? And both sides will be true, but neither side will approve the other side's question. So if we're going to ask a question of people, because these issues are incredibly complicated, it's going to be, 3 or 4 pages of trade-offs and other things that the policymakers have to do. So it's hard to get that question in front of voters in a way that we're going to get a clear answer that both sides will accept.
I have a question for the caller. Are you in favor of a train, bike, and walking corridor, or are you in favor of getting rid of the train and just having the biking and walking?
The thing is that it doesn't take a engineer to figure out that this is a very narrow corridor that was designed way back when to pull out old redwood logs, or, one way in, one way out. It wasn't, I just came back from the East Coast visiting, and I counted 12 train tracks wide, There is no room. You can't have both, is what I'm saying. So
you're in favor of just...
It's either going to be a world-class super destination spot and build it, and they will come. People will be using that to get from east side to the west side, and with the advent of e-bikes and stuff. Are you kidding? It's going to be crazy. And it won't work if there's a chugga, 10-mile-an-hour train going along there. And now we just given them a 10-year contract?
Okay.
Wow.
Okay.
So to answer your question, I'm into having a world-class, state-of-the-art trail, that every generation can use, whether it be strolling with your dog, sitting out, looking over across the bay, or walking or riding your bike, or on your e-skateboard or your e-bike. I would see there would need to be almost 2 trails for the fast-moving commuters and the people that want to stroll along, not have to worry about a bike coming up their back.
All right.
But if you look at it, all the different trellises and all the problems about that, you can't have both. There is no way you can have both.
All right.
So you got to do one or the other.
Well, we're exploring a third option, which is to have small electric buses that move along that corridor as well. I think, I come back to it.
Everybody's built up along Highway 1. Most of the traffic on Highway 1 going over the hill. If you look at it when it is blocked up, it's from people coming from over the hill. Okay. So let's get a center lane devoted for buses, and then people see those buses whizzing by, and they're like, "Dang." Well, and then make it, take our parking fees.
Okay,
and make it advantageous for people.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. I'm gonna let Ryan take this prompt that you gave, and thank you very much for the call. 831-459-4036 if you'd like to call in, but would you like to finish your thought on that, or start your thought on that?
Yeah, I think there's a really good case to be made for having a trail. But I also think it's also way more complicated, which is to put a center lane down the middle of Highway 1 is probably a multi-billion-dollar proposition because you have to take out all the bridges in between. And so if you want to do that, then that's a different tax and a different cost of money. And both sides, I think, have made the mistake of pretending that this issue is easy to solve and there aren't a lot of implications, cost and time and regulatory otherwise. And I think she's right that there's just we're not just going to be able to run a train and it's going to solve all the problems. And I think that's a wrong argument. I also think it's a wrong argument to think that you pull up the tracks and you have a vibrant transportation corridor there when, at least in my district, moving from Santa Cruz, you're likely to have Westcliff Drive move to one lane only in the next couple of years as climate change impacts and takes out part of the roadway. And so people, I think, on the west side are going to use Westcliff Drive. And so moving through a rail corridor up the coast where you're essentially in a gully for all the way up the coast is really problematic. So again, I think there are good arguments to be made on both sides, but I also think we should be clear that both sides have tremendous cost, time, regulatory, and impacts, and we have to sort through that as a community, and it's not as easy as let's have a rail or let's have a trail only. It gets really hard.
And on the topic of just like traffic relates to the same thing of housing and just crowding of the area. And this is a county, it's different than parts of like Santa Clara County where on one side you have mountains, but on the other side you just have an open valley for the most part that you can kind of spread out into, and eventually you hit the next county and then it's not your problem anymore as far as a local jurisdiction or a housing developer. Santa Cruz is quartered on, arguably two sides by the ocean, two sides by Santa Clara County and mountains, and then buttressed by, Monterey County on the bottom. We don't really have room to spread out. And kind of on the housing and traffic bit, regardless of how you want to take it, there's like hard truths that people have to understand about this area. Even ourselves, people that were born here or I wasn't born here, but I've lived here since I was 1. But even if people only had 2 kids per couple in Santa Cruz and the population theoretically stayed level, still for me to grow up in my parents' home and then move out, that's a new house. And then my parents are probably alive when I'm at child having age. So there's another house that needs to be built. Isn't there a harsh reality in Santa Cruz that a lot of the people that I know and you knew that have moved away, that's literally just a reality of this type of a community? And how do you deal with that as a public official, even posing that idea to people, that there's not enough room for every generation to have their own home and spread out here?
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, I think the dynamics are that we are 300,000 people at the bottom of a metro area of 10 million people with that's the greatest economic engine in the history of the world, for better and a lot for worse. And so that we, in many ways, don't control our own destiny. And then the voters have decided in Santa Cruz County that we are going to have an urban services line, and we don't want to expand into farmland. We don't want to expand into rural areas, and we don't want to sprawl, which I think is the exact right decision. But that means that we're going to get more dense in our urban areas, absolutely. And then you have these big trends. 10 years ago or 14 years ago when I was first elected to city council, there was no such thing as Airbnb, where all of a sudden you had houses being transformed into vacation rentals.
You could do that, but you had to get in paper listings and it was a lot more work. Now someone can just slap a listing up on Craigslist or Airbnb and it's done.
Yeah, and we could lose 500 units of our housing stock in a matter of years. We could also have, with this boom, we also have more and more people who have made enormous amounts of money over the hill, who used to go down and buy a house in Pebble Beach or Carmel, and they'd play golf, and this generation wants to windsurf and surf and bike, and so Santa Cruz is much more attractive. So we're losing more of our housing stock to second, third, fourth, fifth homes. That keeps me up at night, because I think that could have the potential to really hollow out our community in a fundamental way that would be profoundly bad for us. And so you have these, and in transportation, you have self-driving cars coming along. You have a bunch of different kinds of transportation options that may be developing soon that could transform our roadways and how people work. The jump bikes that we're seeing around town, that has a potential for changing transportation. So when we're making plans about what kind of housing we're going to have for the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and we're changing how we're living, it's a really, and some of this technology and these big economic forces, it's a really tough challenge.
We only have 5 minutes left, basically 4 for the show. It is a good time, since you do live in Santa Cruz City. You're not a city council member right now, but you do vote in the city elections. What's your thought on the Measure M right now, the rent control measure that's officially on the ballot and got far more signatures than the requisite amount to get it on the ballot?
Sure. So it'll be decided on purely by the voters, but I am a voter. And the short answer is I have real concerns with it. I think in a community like ours, where you have a never-ending supply of students as potential renters, that it creates a real incentive to rent to students and not to families, not to seniors who are in this community, because the students will turn over and you're able to not have to deal with eviction, more strict eviction rules, and you're able to reset the rent every year, versus a family who may sit there for 20 years or a senior who may be there for 20 years. And the thing I worry about is that it not only creates an incentive for landlords, and we're seeing this now where some landlords are selling, and that it becomes people's second, third, fourth homes. So we lose that housing stock. Or if they do keep it as rentals, there's a real incentive to rent it to students, even at a lower price than you will to seniors or working people or other people in this community.
But there are regulations as well in Measure M and other. Richmond is the bill that it was mostly based off of. And the Richmond bill did pass 3 years ago, that do govern the amount that it can be raised from the previous tenant, and that a new tenant would at least be able to access that information. So you wouldn't be able to just raise the rent just because, June came along. You can't just jack it up for September immediately.
No, but you can raise it more than if you have somebody who's been there for 10 years, 20 years, and you don't have to worry about some of the eviction things. And so there's a way to do this that I've been advocating for both the city and the county, which is to trigger the relocation rules, which is if you raise the rent more than a certain percentage, and whether that percentage is 7% or 8% or whatever.
But financially pushing them out of the home, essentially.
Yeah, if you push somebody out of a home, then you have to pay relocation and you have to give a lot of notice, and you have to pay relocation, which creates a financial incentive, but made for landlords not to raise the rent. But it also, and it brings in some of the really bad actors that are raising the rent at an immoral rate. But it doesn't create some of the negative incentives that this one does. And I'm hopeful that whether this passes or doesn't pass, we'll be able to look at some nuanced approaches to address our particular housing market.
Now, I don't want this to sound like whiny or too confrontational, but don't you feel like it's almost at the point, and a lot of people I've talked with, most of the people I've talked with that are against it live in Aptos, and I'm like, well, I'm glad that you're not voting in the city election. And a lot of the people in Santa Cruz, even older people that I consider like, wow, they're a little more conservative than me, are very much for it, even if it is too over the top by some people's measures, and that we can fix it later, because renters have had no say for so long that honestly, when someone's abused and pestered, sometimes they come back, some kid that's bullied might punch the bully really hard. and then we can fix it later. But don't you see the perspective that some people are like, we don't really care if this is an overcorrection right now because we've been put in such a bad position for so long, and landlords have had pretty much all of the say for so long that maybe we need an overcorrection just to get their attention?
So, yes, and I've heard this, and I totally understand it, where there's just anger and a sense that, well, we have to do something, and that if it's an overcorrection, the thing I worry about the most is that one, it can only be corrected by voters. It can't be corrected by people. The second part is that you're going to have all these unintended consequences that people didn't think about, and it's really going to hurt people in the short term. The kinds of people who expected to be helped are going to get hurt more than they're helped.
I disagree with that, and I think that people saying they're going to sell off their rental properties are bluffing right now, because I think that they're going to keep renting and they're going to keep paying their mortgages from rentals. But thank you so much, Supervisor Ryan Coonerty, for being on the show. This has been Unquestionable. I'm Dan Wu. This is KZSC Santa Cruz. I'm going to get out of here and let Alyssa have her do right to the station, which I just took 22 seconds of. Thank you so much for listening.
It's easy to pass judgment when you're first starting to live.